taken off for a week due to the Chag. It's always good to enjoy the Chag and to celebrate it. And we had a Zis and Pesach, a very pleasant and sweet Pesach. For now, we will jump back into the wonderful, wonderful world that is the Mishna Berurah. And we're going to discuss today about one who has not prayed for some reason like forgetting and some error, and also what happens if you make are withheld for davening for some reason. Okay, so let's talk about the first halach over here. So there are 12, so we'll try to get through as many as we can today. We may have to make this into a 2-session Mishnah Berurah session, but let us begin. So let's talk about our case. So our case is if you erred or were compelled. Yeah, this is we've talked about this a little bit before. We talked about it in Siman Ches. We talked about someone missing the time for prayer, and we talked about it in Siman Kuf Aleph also. And so we'll those cases were not the same that we're talking about today. So we'll explain the differences now with Mishnah Berurah. So if one erred, okay, we're in Halacha Aleph, if one erred or was held back for some compelling reason and did not daven the morning prayer, he may recite the afternoon prayer twice. This is basically recycling the language of the Brisa and Brachos. Okay, the first one is for Mincha, and the second one is to make up for it. That's his word is Tashlumin. That's the word means to make up for it, meaning Shacharis. And if you flip it, you daven the first prayer in the afternoon for Shacharis purposes, you do not fulfill your obligation of prayer because it is considered making up for something. So you can't make up for something until you fulfilled your obligation. And you must pray again. So that'll be 3 times you have to pray. Okay, number 1 for Mincha, number 2, okay, for the Shacharis prayer. And this too is the rule whenever you have to make up a prayer for makeups. It's really to pray a prayer for makeups. Okay, that's what the actual words say. So now what do we say about that? So the Mishnah explains that if you erred, it's to exclude the case of intentionally skipping prayer, which we will discuss in the 7th halacha here. And so, therefore, we talked about earlier that there's other cases in Ches, in Kufay, in 101 and 98, that when you couldn't focus for whatever reason. You had to go to the bathroom, you had to do this, right? And so those were considered an error of some kind, okay? And so here's where you have a compelling reason, like you were ill or you were drunk, okay? And we'll talk about that later in Halacha Ches. Now, what about if you were a person who lost a loved one on that day where you are required to bury them, like a spouse or a parent or a child, and you're the one who has to bury them? Okay, they're called an onain on that day. Now, if you go ahead and bury them first, we learned earlier in Siman Ayin Aleph, okay, 7.1 about the Indian Kriya Shema, that you don't have to make it up. Okay. So if you don't have water to wash your hands for prayer, it is considered ones, okay? So that is considered it, and you may make it up again. You would do that. However, you should not waste your time not getting water. So if you thought you needed water and you missed the time, that's considered oopsies, right? That's an oopsies, that's fine. And if you look again in chapter 92, we discussed it there. Okay. Also, too, we said in Siman 93 that if you were engaged in some type of public works project and there's something that was a public wheel that required your attention, you can make up for that case as well. Okay. However, you should pray your prayer as a free will prayer and add something into the blessing as we explained in chapter 93. Okay. So that wasn't so clear. If we're making up the Shacharis prayer during Mincha, do we use the Shacharis text or repeat the Mincha text? If a woman may need to pray once, does she have to make it up as well? Okay, so those are 2 questions. So when you say it, that's a good question. So we'll get to it in a second, but let me get to the end of this, and then I'll get back to your question. I believe we answered here in a second. Okay. And the next Mishnah Berurah explains that if you didn't recite Shacharis, and is there, the Mishnah Berurah asked the question down, is there Tashlumin for Kriya Shema? So we said that at the end of Siman Nun Ches that it's only Divrei Torah. There's no makeup for Shema. Okay? So you can still say it and also recite the blessings of the Shema afterwards. Okay? But there's no makeup, you just have a long time to say the blessings of the Shema. Okay? So that's the difference. And so if you want to, you can recite the Shema in the middle of that, but there was no enactment to make it up after midday. And we saw some people say you shouldn't even say the blessings of the Shema later than that. So we talked about you have to pray during Mincha. And what if you're the Shliach Tzibur? So if you're the Shliach Tzibur, you fulfill your obligation of making up for the other prayer in doing the second prayer out loud. And you just have to think about, I'm doing it for my purposes to make up for the other one. Okay? And also to help out somebody else. So as long as you're helping people fulfill their obligations, you can do that. And they have to do two, we said. And we're saying that listening to the Shliach Tzibur to fulfill your obligation of your missed prayer doesn't help. Okay? Whether it's for the evening prayer service or the morning prayer service, or if you missed Arvit, you have to make up for Shacharis, and you're making up Shacharis at Mincha. Okay? Because there was no allowance for you to use the repetition of the Amidah as the makeup prayer. It's only for people who don't know it. Again, with the exception is if you're davening yourself, he was saying. However, if you did that, then you could rely on that if you didn't remember to do it again. And that's what we say. And even though we say that they weren't intending to do that, since you went ahead and listened to it, that's okay. Okay, and especially he says that for Arvis, for Shacharis, it's even more lenient. Now you need to make the first one for Mincha when you're making it up, because you have to do your obligations first, because that's what you need to do. If you reverse it, which means that you had the intention to say the first prayer to make up for missing the Shacharis prayer, so you don't fulfill the obligation, because they did not enact this makeup tefillah until you have finished your obligation tefillah. And some people say that you don't have to do it again unless you said explicitly that you were making one for the other. But if you just daven two, right, and you have to daven two, then that won't count. So one example of this would be if it's after Shabbos and you forgot to say Havdalah in the first one, but you said it in the second one. Okay? Then what they basically say is that would be a case of where you definitely have messed up the two and have to make up the first one, because you're showing that the second one was your obligatory one. Okay? Now, it's better that when you go ahead and repeat the prayer service, that you make the condition that you're making it for your obligation or for your makeup. And you can also make the condition that if you're not obligated to make the prayer the second time, then this is going to just simply be a free offering prayer. Okay? And he says that when it says you don't fulfill the obligation, it doesn't matter. The Mechaber is saying that it doesn't matter if you did it intentionally or not, but we just said otherwise. Okay? However, if you go ahead and make the second prayer service to make it up, and the first one is for the obligation, and now you make an error in the obligatory one, and you don't say, for example, Talu Matar, like we used to say, or you add Talu Matar into it, okay? And you have to go ahead and repeat the whole Shemona Esrei. So since you went ahead and davened and you had it in the correct order, then that would be acceptable. That would be an exception to this rule. Okay? Because you already did the first tefillah for the purpose of your obligation. It just has an error in it that caused you to make that one up, but that then becomes another makeup. Okay? So therefore, if you an erred obligatory one does not cause a second makeup. It means it doesn't count for making an obligatory prayer service. It's just you just prayed, okay? As long as you had the intention to make the prayer for the intentional one. As long as you have the second one in mind to be the makeup one, that's fine. So back to the questions. So women are obligated to make up the ones that they miss if they regularly daven one or the other. But if they don't, then there's no quote-unquote obligation to mix it up. So it depends on what you're doing. And the other question was about making up, use the mincha text. So if you're davening mincha, you say mincha twice. And we'll see that also with other places too. It's like Motzei Shabbos, you say, if you mess up, if you forget to daven, we'll see in a little bit that if you forget weekday one, you have to say Shabbos twice. So if you forget mincha on Erev Shabbos, you say Shabbos twice. We'll see those in a minute. Okay, so halacha beis over here. So if you forget for whatever reason you were not able to say the afternoon prayer, you say the evening prayers twice. The first one is for Mariv, and the second one is for making it up. If you erred and did not recite Arvit, you should say Shacharis twice. The first one is for Shacharis, and the second one is for making it up. Okay? And you have to say the blessing of Yotzer, the first blessing of the Shema, and also say the 18 blessings for Shacharis. Then you'll say Ashrei, and after you say the second Ashrei, you can then recite the makeup prayer for Arvit after that. And the Ramah adds, and when you pray the evening prayer twice, because you didn't say Mincha twice, you should also say Ashrei again. Okay, well now we'll understand why. So you repeat Shacharis twice when you missed Arvis, and one may not go ahead and eat anything until they have made up the second prayer, because the time for prayer has reached, and if you start, you are not allowed to stop. Okay, the Magen Avraham says this. But in another book known as the Machazitza Shekel, they disagree with this. So they say that that you should try to get the two of them to be as close to each other as possible. Okay, and so therefore, if you went ahead and started eating, you would have to stop. Okay, so that's what they argue. Okay, and we say over here that you have to wait until you finish the second Ashrei. So there's one Ashrei in Psuki Zimra. There's a second Ashrei after Shmona Esrei. And you shouldn't pause in between the end of that and the other one, the Mishnah explains, because there's even to sit and learn, because it's part of finishing up the morning prayer service. And you shouldn't interrupt it with anything else. Okay, so nonetheless, the Mishnah explains that Chazar Shatz, which is there on your obligation one, you can go ahead and listen to that, because it's considered you're still in the middle of your prayer service. Okay? And he says, also see what we wrote in Siman Mem Zion, in the Mishnah Berurah there, in the name of the Or Zarua. So here's what he says. So in Siman Mem Zion, okay, he talks about, over here, Mem Zion is talking about the blessing of the Torah. And the question over here is if that you are making a break between saying the blessing of the Torah in Ahava Rabbah, and then you want to go ahead and learn Torah afterwards. Okay, and he brings down over here in the case of the Or Zarua that it's not considered a break, and one may go ahead and continue with learning afterwards. However, people disagree with that opinion of the Or Zarua. And so, therefore, it's if you went ahead and did it and thought about it and had it in mind, that would all be acceptable to the Evan. That doesn't say that here. I'm adding that in to give context for that law. Okay. Now over here, you have to say the Shmona Esrei, the whole thing, and that means with Tachanun, and you can't say anything between the end of Shmona Esrei and Tachanun. And then you also say Ashrei, the Mechaber says, and that way you are still in the middle. That way, that you can have your makeup tefillah look like it is being prayed in the midst of the comforting words of Torah. And we explained that earlier in Siman 93, and that's why it's being placed there. So you should nonetheless still say Ashrei, and then you also have Lama Natseach and Uval Tzion. So you should say that as well, and don't say the Tashlumin until afterwards. Okay? And so the other people add in that when you're going to make up Mincha, you should say Asher before that as well. Okay? And that's what you should do, but you don't need to. Okay? But as we mentioned earlier in Siman Kufhei, right, we just said you have to take a little bit of a break in between two prayer services, enough to just take a break for a short 6-foot walk. Okay, so, and we bring down the Ramah says that you should say Ashrei in between the two different prayers. And he says that because you want to have Ashrei before Mincha. You have to say 3 Ashreis a day. However, there are those amongst the Kabbalists who disagree with saying Ashrei at night. And even though it's being said for the makeup for Mincha prayer, there are people who say not to do that. And in one case, someone writes that if you decide to go ahead and do it, you do have on whom to rely. However, you should still say Ashrei, at least to get it in for the 3rd time, even after Mincha. Okay, so if you come late to shul and they start davening Mincha, daven with them, and then say Ashrei afterwards again as well. Okay, and the Magen Avraham warns that you should only read it like you're reciting words of Torah. Okay, halacha gimel over here. So when you go ahead and make up the missed prayer, you are supposed to do it in the time for when prayer can be said, but in a time prayer may not be said, you may not make it up. So what does that mean? So the Mishna explains. Some people explain that it is referring to the fact that the rabbis of the Talmud Chazal, they enacted make-up times for prayer service only when you are engaged in other prayer services. Okay? And then you have to do that either right after you daven one Shemona Esrei or you've said Ashrei. But many other opinions disagree with that approach, and they say that what you should do is you should say the make-up prayer service immediately after the obligatory prayer. However, it doesn't matter. This rule doesn't matter. It's just something that's nice to do. Okay? And so if you have not, for example, if you have not prayed the evening service and you're davening Shacharis and you say it twice, then you should try to get the second Shacharis in before the passing of 4 hours of the day, which would be the normal time for Shacharis Tefillah. So the makeup time is the same. Okay? Because that's what you're basically borrowing from, is that time period. Which is not the case if you go after the 4th hour. Then you only are getting reward for prayer, not as makeup and not as obligation, but only as an offering of prayer for prayer's own sake. However, some people add in a new type of rule, and this is the Mishna is explaining this way. So, if you daven Shacharis, okay, and you only said that one after the 4th hour of the day. Okay, so he's saying that you miss Shacharis, you miss the time for Shacharis. So if you didn't daven at Mincha, so then you would have to then make up the evening prayer with 2, and you have to do it before midnight, because that's when you really should daven that prayer at midnight as well. Okay. However, people disagree with this, that the make-up time periods for the prayer are as following. You have make-up time for Mincha all night long until daybreak, and if you didn't daven Shacharis, then you have makeup time until the beginning of mincha time, not the 4th hour. Okay, and then with mincha you have that midday plus a half an hour until that bein hashmashos, on the time between sunset and 3 stars coming out. And that's even if on a day where you have Musaf, okay, and you daven Musaf first, you daven Musaf before that. Okay? So the Mishna then explains, this is my direct quotes from all the sources. However, here's what you actually should do. If you didn't daven immediately after the first prayer that you say, then you should say it only as a free offering prayer, a Torah Sadava, meaning they should say, if I am obligated, then this is for my obligation, and if this is not, let it be as a free will prayer before you. And he says that's not only his chiddush, but it's also the novel approach of the Pri Megadim as well. Let me get to your question here. Okay, what if one's attitude to perform the specific text is not right? Is it not an offense to go ahead and pray anyway? Good question. So we answered that a little bit ago, which is in the previous 2 Simanim, which is that people aren't focused so much, so you just kind of do what you're required to do, and don't worry about the makeup stuff. All right. Well, we're running out of time here, so we'll do halacha dal, and then we'll call it a day. Okay, so making up for the lost prayer that you missed is only for the immediate next prayer time. If you were to err and forget shacharis, and you also didn't remember it at mincha time, you would say, and you also didn't pray at mincha time, you'll say arvish twice, and the second one is to make up for mincha, but the shacharis one may not be made up for, and this rule applies onward for all prayer services. So the Mishna explains, what does hasamucha mean? So what does the most immediate one means? So the rabbis write that this is an interesting rule when it applies to Musaf, on days that have Musaf, like Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh. So that if you haven't davened Musaf yet, you can't make up Musaf for the second one, because you have all day to say that. But if you forgot to say Shacharis, and you then say Musaf, and the time of Shacharis hasn't passed yet, then you can go ahead and say Shacharis. Because they're really 2 different prayers. One has nothing to do with the other one. They're 2 different types of prayers altogether. So one who forgot and didn't daven either Shacharis or Musaf, and at Mincha time, what it should do then is say Mincha, and then it should say Musaf, because Musaf is still the obligatory one, and then you make up Shacharis. Okay? However, one little cool thing over here is you said Musaf before you said Mincha, you also fulfill your obligation. Okay, so, and we said, so what if you miss Shacharis and Mincha? You only make up for the Mincha prayer at Arvis, but not for the Shacharis prayer. So it says that's also the rule if you said Mincha and you're not able to finish up for Shacharis, okay? So you only made up for the immediate one after it, not for 2 before it, okay? And so even though he's saying that even though you missed Mincha too, even if you didn't miss Mincha, you can't make up for Shacharis later. All right, so we will hold it here for today. We'll come back to pick it up with number 5 until the end for next week. Thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time.